The drill instructor hit the barracks light at 0400 and did not raise his voice, which was the first thing that confused Sithrak Vorkalen. Senior instructor Drathon Vale's predecessor had used a voice like a rupture alarm, loud, cyclic, designed to trigger the fight-or-flight cascade in every species on the roster. Vale did not do that. He walked in with a hand lamp and set it on the floor in the center of the room so that everyone above the third bunk could see him, and then he stood with his hands behind his back and waited. He was Hesk, a species Sithrak had studied briefly during intake orientation, gray-skinned and compact, with eyes that could swivel independently in their sockets, giving them a permanent impression of casual surveillance. Vale's eyes moved in different directions right now, one fixed on the far wall, one tracking the bunks. The effect was deeply unsettling. Sithrak had been awake for 11 minutes. He was Velhari, a species with a proprioceptive sensitivity that made it nearly impossible to sleep through atmospheric pressure changes, and the shuttle bay 2 levels down had been cycling hard since 0340. He had spent those 11 minutes lying on his bunk doing absolutely nothing, waiting for whatever happened next, because that was what Velhari did. They processed, they categorized, and they moved only when they had assigned a probability to the possible outcomes. This approach had served his species well enough to produce a civilization, and Sithrak saw no reason to abandon it now. Vale said, "You have 40 seconds to be outside in formation. If I'm doing math on my fingers to count you, you do not want to be the one who made me use my thumbs." Then he turned and walked out. 40 seconds. Sithrak swung his legs off the bunk, while his mind ran the calculation. 16 cadets in Barracks 7, 4 of them alien species with gravity sensitivity that would require an extra second of balance calibration per limb. One of them, the human, Connolly occupying the lower left bunk which put her nearest the door, an advantage that would be offset by the fact that she was almost certainly the deepest sleeper in the room because humans, as Sithrak had already observed, slept like they had been shot. He was wrong about that. Connolly was already standing. She had somehow, in the span of Vale's 40-second declaration, found both boots, and she was lacing the second one with a speed that suggested she had rehearsed it. Her bunkmate, a young Tharvan named Osavek whose bioluminescent neck frills were still dark with sleep, stared at her with the particular expression Sithrak had come to recognize as the multi-species equivalent of existential bewilderment. "She sleeps with them half-laced," said the Kreth cadet in the bunk above Sithrak, Emrel Sothas, who had apparently made a study of the human's habits during the 2 weeks since formation. "I have been watching. She leaves about 3 loops untied. When she hears an alarm, she does not have to start from 0. Sithrak filed this information without comment. He was already pulling on his outer layer, hands moving in the sequence he had drilled before lights out: garment, closure, belt, ID tag. 12 seconds. Outside, the parade ground was a flat expanse of packed mineral aggregate under a sky the color of a bruise. The Kavareth Combined Arms Academy sat on a moon that had been terraformed with functional efficiency, and no aesthetic consideration whatsoever. The air was breathable, the gravity was set to a near-standard 0.96, and slightly higher than comfortable for most of the enrolled species, and the ground was always slightly too cold for whatever clothing choice you made. It was an excellent place to be miserable in, which Sithrak suspected was precisely the point. He made it into the third row with 4 seconds to spare. Connolly was in the front row. Vale emerged from the barracks doorway and let his gaze move across the formation. The swivel-eyed appraisal took less than 3 seconds. 38 seconds, he said. "Cadet Vorkalen, you were last into position." This was not quite accurate. Cadet Suvrak had emerged 2 steps behind Sithrak, but Sithrak did not correct him, because he had calculated in week 1 that correcting Vale's statements was a form of expenditure that returned negative value. "Yes, senior instructor. I notice this pattern repeats." Vale did not say it with heat. He said it the way one might note that a hinge needed oil. "Connolly." Senior Instructor. Time: 32 seconds, Senior Instructor by my count. Can you see better in the dark than Cadet Vorkalen? No, Senior Instructor. I prepped my gear before I slept. Vale was quiet for a moment. One eye moved towards Seathrak, the other stayed on Connolly. That is information, he said. Then to the formation. You are going to run 8 kilometers in full kit in the dark in 40 minutes. If you go over 40 minutes, you run it again. If anyone falls behind the pace line, everyone falls behind the pace line. Move. 8 kilometers in 40 minutes was brisk for a formation run. It was not punitive for every species. Kreth, for instance, were endurance runners with shock-absorbing foot pads designed for exactly this terrain. But for species like Velhari, whose skeletal density prioritized lateral stability over forward propulsion, it required a specific mechanical discipline that Seathrak had been practicing privately for 3 weeks. He knew he could hold the pace. He was not certain about Osivek. He was not, it turned out, the only one thinking about Osivek. Connolly dropped back to the 3rd row at the 4-kilometer mark. This was notable because she had been running in the first cluster, keeping pace with the Kreth cadets, and the move backward was counterintuitive from a performance standpoint. Seathrak observed her positioning herself 2 steps behind and slightly left of Osivek, who was struggling. The Tharvan's bioluminescent frills were flickering, a stress indicator Seathrak had categorized in week 1. Tharvan respiratory systems were not built for sustained exertion in cold air. Their respiratory membranes constricted below 8 degrees, which was exactly what the temperature on the parade ground was at 0400. Connolly said something. Her voice was below Seathrak's range at this distance and pace, and he could not hear the words, but he watched Osivek's rhythm change, a subtle correction to stride length, a slight adjustment of shoulder angle. The flickering in the neck frills steadied. They finished in 37 minutes. Osivek crossed the line 11 seconds before the cutoff and did not collapse, which Seathrak assessed as operationally significant. Vale was standing at the finish marker with his arms folded. He did not announce a time. He simply looked at the formation as it reassembled, and then he looked at Connolly, who had returned to her original position in the first cluster, and then at Osivek, and his near-independent eyes moved in a way that might have indicated calculation, or might have been entirely unrelated, because Seathrak still could not read Hesk facial microexpressions with any reliability. Breakfast, Vale said, then range work. That had been 6 weeks ago. Seathrak was now standing on the lip of the Kara descent, which was not a name that appeared anywhere in the Academy's official curriculum documentation, and which the senior cadets referred to in the 3rd-floor barracks with a kind of reverence that had a thin skin of terror stretched over it. It was a 6-kilometer wilderness course cut into the Moon's northern ridge system, where the terraforming had been done more hastily, and the result was a landscape of loose shale, thermal vents and scrub growth that did not behave the way vegetation should. The course required navigation without active electronic assistance, rope work on 3 sections of vertical terrain, a water crossing at approximately the midpoint, and a timed extraction from a simulated structural collapse in the final kilometer. It had to be completed in teams of 4. Teams were not assigned, teams were self-selected. This was, Seathrak had concluded after 48 hours of observation, intentional. Vale had announced the exercise 2 days prior and had provided exactly 2 specifications, the team size and the time limit. He had then stood in front of the formation for a full 30 seconds without speaking, which meant that any cadet who wanted to plan needed to plan visibly, in front of their peers, with full accountability for who chose whom and who was left. Seathrak had run the calculations. He was Velhari. His proprioceptive sensitivity made him an exceptional navigator even without instruments, which addressed the first challenge. His upper limb mechanics were suited to rope work. His species did not swim naturally but had a documented tolerance for cold water immersion that exceeded most enrolled species on the roster. He was, on paper, a competent candidate for any of the 4-slot combinations. He had run those calculations alone, in the 20-minute gap after Vale's announcement and before the evening meal, and had arrived at 3 potential team configurations and 1 optimal one. Then he had sat down at the meal table and discovered that Connolly had already assembled a team. It was not the optimal team. It contained Osivek, whose endurance was improving but who still struggled with cold-weather respiratory function. It contained Imrel Sathas, the Kreth cadet, whose running capability was excellent and whose rope work was serviceable, but whose thermal tolerance in cold water was near the bottom of the species roster. And it contained a Guvari cadet named Preth Salin, who was the quietest person in Barracks 7, who almost never spoke during formation or meal periods, and whose file Cthrak had not been able to read because the Academy's roster system classified Guvari physical attribute data at a tier above his access level. Connolly had looked at Cthrak across the meal table and said, 4-person team, you're the 4th. Cthrak had been calculating whether to point out that Osivek and Sathas were problematic variables for a cold water crossing, when he noticed that Osivek was looking at him with something that registered, in Cthrak's categorization system, as tentative hope. And Sathas was looking at him sideways with the expression Cthrak had come to associate with someone who had already decided on an answer, and was waiting to see if the other person arrived at the same one. And Preth Salin was not looking at him at all, which was Preth Salin's standard expression of interest. Cthrak had said, "You have not addressed the water crossing." "Preth breathes underwater," Connolly said. "They'll guide the crossing, you navigate the ridge. Imrel runs point on the descent. I'll manage Osivek on the cold sections." Cthrak had wanted to note that manage was not a specific enough operational term, but he found himself saying acceptable instead, which surprised him slightly. That had been 2 days ago. Now he was standing on the lip of the Kara descent with his team. Vale stood 20 meters back, watching all 4 teams at their start positions. He had said nothing since the course brief that morning. He was doing the swivel-eye thing that Cthrak could not read. Connolly was checking the anchor point for their first rope descent. Her hands moved through the process without visual reference. She ran her fingers along the join, applied lateral pressure, checked the secondary clip with her thumb. She had done this before, somewhere, with enough repetition that the check had become proprioceptive rather than cognitive. "Good," she said, and stepped back to look at Cthrak. "You have the nav plot." He touched his temple, the Velhari convention for indicating a memorized route, to within 4 meters on the ridge sections. The thermal vent distribution on the lower course was not fully documented. I have modeled the likely configuration based on atmospheric readings this morning. Connolly did not say, "Are you sure?" or "That might not be enough." She said, "If you hit a variance, call it early and we reroute. Don't correct silently." Cthrak marked that for later categorization. It was an instruction about communication, not about competence. The difference was relevant. "Preth," Connolly said without turning, "river temp." Preth had been crouching at the edge of the slope, fingers in the dirt, for approximately 40 seconds. "Colder than yesterday. Thermal vents are cycling lower this morning. Crossing time will be fast, the current is stronger." Their voice was the same temperature as everything else about them, precise, flat, informational. "How fast?" 7 minutes at controlled pace, less if the current pulls. Osivek. Preth looked at the Tharvan. "You stay between me and Connolly, center of the crossing formation. You focus on footing and breathing, we handle direction." Osivek's frills flickered once, then settled. "Understood." "Imrel," Connolly said. Sathas cracked his knuckles, a Kreth comfort gesture Cthrak had categorized, and grinned. "Descent's clean. I ran the sightline from up here. There's a shale section at the 200-meter mark that's going to move under weight, but if we stagger and keep the horizontal spacing tight, it disperses the load. I'll call the spacing." Connolly nodded. She looked at the course. She looked at the team. She said, "We have one objective. The team crosses the line together, not fastest together, everyone clear." Seathrak recognized this as the operating principle she had applied to every shared exercise for the past 6 weeks. He had been classifying it, imprecisely, as a tactical preference for redundancy. He was beginning to suspect it was something with a different name. "Clear," said Imrel. "Clear," said Osivek. Preth said nothing, which was how Preth indicated affirmation. Seathrak said, "Clear." Then Vale's hand came down, and the run began. The first kilometer was the descent, and Satha's was correct about the shale. The 200-meter mark was a wide apron of compressed mineral plates that had the surface texture of stable ground and the subsurface integrity of a collapsed file structure. When Satha's hit it at pace, the first 4 plates held, and the 5th went sideways with a sound like someone sorting gravel and took 2 more with it. He had already called the spacing, and Seathrak was 3 meters right and a half step behind, which was enough lateral separation that the shift did not cascade. "Left edge is better," Satha said, not shouting, just reporting, while simultaneously correcting his footing with the smooth mechanical precision of Kreth musculature designed for exactly this type of terrain. "The composition changes at the edge, more basalt, less compression aggregate." Seathrak moved left. He was watching Osivek, who was behind him and struggling with the gradient. Tharvan skeletal structure was optimized for flat terrain or climbing, not diagonal descent with unpredictable footing. The Tharvan's respiratory frills were starting to flicker again. "Osivek," Seathrak said. He was not certain why he said it. The Tharvan looked at him and Seathrak said, "Use the lateral anchor points. The ridge outcrops are stable. You do not need to follow the center line exactly." Osivek shifted, found a lateral protrusion of basalt, and used it as a stabilizer. The descent continued. Later, running the sequence back in his mind with the cool precision his species applied to stored events, Seathrak would note that he had done what Connolly did. He had observed a problem in a team member, calculated a solution, and deployed it. He would also note that he had done it before Connolly intervened, which meant he was operating from the same pattern she was, which meant the pattern was either something he had learned from her or something that had always been available to him, and had simply been waiting for a context in which its application was obvious. He did not reach a definitive conclusion on that point during the descent. He simply kept moving. The ridge corridor below the shale apron was his territory. Seathrak navigated by pressure gradient, by the micro-variations in atmospheric resistance that Velhari sensory anatomy was designed to read, by the pattern of thermal vent output that he had mapped from the morning's atmospheric readings. 3 times in the corridor section, the mapped route required modification because the vent configuration did not match his model, and 3 times he called it early, as Connolly had instructed. The reroutes cost time. He estimated 74 seconds over the corridor section versus his projected pace. He filed this as acceptable variance and kept moving. Connolly, behind him, said nothing about the reroutes. She made the turn when he made the turn, and so did everyone else. The water crossing was a shallow river with a strong transverse current, stronger than Preth had estimated from the atmospheric data, which meant the actual crossing time was going to be less than 7 minutes, which also meant less controlled. Preth entered first and found the footing line, a series of submerged ledges running at an angle to the current that would allow bipedal species to maintain balance if they moved in a staggered formation and accepted some degree of drift. The water was cold. Not lethal cold, Seathrak species tolerance data said that comfortably, but cold enough that Osivek's frills went fully dark the moment the current hit the Tharvan's legs. "Breathe," Connolly said from Osivek's left. "Slow exhale. Your diaphragm wants to lock up, don't let it." "I am aware of my respiratory physiology," Osivek said, through teeth that were only slightly too close together. "Good, then you know how to override it. Exhale." A pause. "Better," Connolly said. Seathrak was moving through the crossing at his own pace, which was fast. Velhari did not share the Tharvan's cold sensitivity, but he found himself doing a thing he had not planned, slowing to stay roughly even with Osivek and Connolly, rather than crossing at maximum speed and waiting on the far bank. He processed this briefly. There was no tactical reason to slow. The team's overall time was what mattered, not his individual time, and Osivek had Connolly, who was demonstrably capable of managing the crossing. He slowed anyway. Preth on Osivek's right glanced at him. Their species had transparent second eyelids which they deployed in water, and the effect made their eyes unreadable. But Preth glanced at him, and Seathrak noted the glance. They crossed in 6 minutes and 40 seconds, not 7. The current had been faster than the estimate, but the staggered formation had worked, and Osivek crossed without a respiratory incident. On the far bank, the Tharvan stood in the weak early light with frills flickering as blood returned to them, and looked at Seathrak and said, "You did not need to stay." "The formation needed cohesion at the crossing," Seathrak said. Osivek said, "Yes, and nothing else," which was how the Tharvan agreed with a thing that they understood to be true but also to be incomplete. The structural collapse simulation in the final kilometer was a constructed scenario. The Academy's engineering cadre had assembled a section of prefabricated paneling and triggered a controlled drop, leaving a debris field with 3 designated extraction points. The briefing had specified that all 4 team members needed to reach an extraction point. It had not specified which extraction point. The debris field was a mess of angled panels and loose aggregate that required upper body strength and flexibility to navigate, and the extraction points were positioned at the far end, the near left, and the near right of the field. The far end was the straightest path but the most obstructed. The near left was partially clear. The near right had collapsed in a configuration that blocked direct access but created an indirect route through a gap in the panel array. Seathrak stood at the edge of the field for 4 seconds, reading it. Sothas was already moving left, which was correct. The Kreth's strength advantage made him the right choice for the near-left route, where a large panel required lifting to create a passage. Preth moved without discussion toward the far-end route, because the far-end extraction point was elevated 2 meters above the field floor, accessible only by a vertical climb, and Guvari physiology meant that Preth could climb that section in the time it would take anyone else to assess whether it was worth trying. The near-right gap was narrow. Seathrak measured it visually at approximately 43 centimeters, narrow enough to exclude Sothas's shoulder width, workable for Seathrak, Osivek, and Connolly. "Right," he said. Connolly did not ask why. She moved right. Osivek moved right. The gap was navigable but not comfortable, and the angled panels above it were resting on a friction fit that would not hold indefinitely. Seathrak moved through first, fastest, and came out at the near-right extraction point. He then looked back at the gap and at the panels and recalculated. The panels were shifting, and Osivek was mid-transit, and the gap was closing by approximately 2 centimeters per minute as the debris field continued its slow settlement. He went back in. This was not in his original 4-second analysis. He had not planned it. He had simply observed the panel shift, run the arithmetic on the closing rate versus Osivek's transit speed, and concluded that the margins did not favor Osivek completing the transit without assistance. The conclusion generated the action without any intermediate deliberation that he could locate afterward. He put his shoulder against the lower panel, not pushing. The panel was not under direct load, and pushing would be counterproductive but blocking, holding it against its tendency to settle. Osivek came through. Connolly came through last, moving fast, and when she came out she looked at him with an expression Seathrak's categorization system flagged as something it did not have a precise label for. Not gratitude, which was a softer thing. Not respect, which was a transactional thing. Something that registered as recognition, the way you looked at a thing when you had believed it existed and had now seen it demonstrated. "Good call," she said. The margins were unfavorable, Seathrak said. Yeah, she looked at the now settled gap. They were. Above them, breath dropped from the elevated extraction point like something that had been waiting there for a long time, and landed with a sound like pressed fabric rather than impact. Sothas appeared from the left, arriving at the near-left extraction point 10 seconds after Seathrak's team. He pumped one fist in the Kreth convention for a successfully completed action, which Seathrak had learned in Week 2 meant something between satisfaction and the physical pleasure of a well-executed movement. All 4 extraction points were covered. The full team was across. The time when Vale read it from the checkpoint at the field's edge was 43 minutes and 11 seconds. The course record for a team run was 39 minutes, held by a team from 4 cycles prior. They were not the record. They were complete. Vale looked at each of them for a moment. His eyes moved independently in the way that still resisted Seathrak's attempts at interpretation. Then he said, "Document your route variations in the debrief log, all 4 of you." He paused. "The panel hold in the collapse section. Vorkalen, that was your call." "Yes, senior instructor." "It was not in the course parameters." "No, senior instructor." Vale was quiet for a moment. "Why did you go back in?" Seathrak considered the question. He had a technically accurate answer: the margin analysis, the panel settlement rate, the transit time calculation. But he had run that analysis in a fraction of a second, and the action had followed without a gap that he could identify as decision-making. The analysis was real. It was not the whole of what had happened. "The gap was closing," he said. "The team needed to come through." Vale looked at him with both eyes simultaneously, which was unusual enough that Seathrak logged it as behaviorally significant. "Yes," Vale said, "it did." The debrief was held the following morning in the main instruction hall, which was a room Seathrak associated primarily with policy recitations and administrative logistics. Vale ran debriefs differently. He set up a topographic projection of the Kara descent in the center of the room, imported from the course survey drone, and went through every team's route with surgical efficiency. He did not rank the teams. He did not comment on time differential. He asked each team a single question: what did you trade and why? The first team, a Kreth-heavy formation that had posted the best time, described a clean, fast line through the center of the course that had required them to bypass the indirect route to the near-right extraction point in favor of a direct charge at the far-end point, which they had reached 2 minutes faster than Seathrak's team. Their answer to Vale's question was, "We traded flexibility for pace, because our composition made pace our primary advantage." Vale nodded and said nothing. The second team had encountered a navigation failure on the ridge corridor. They were not carrying a Velhari, and without proprioceptive navigation, they had relied on a mapping device that had given them a 3-minute error before they corrected and had recovered cleanly, finishing 5 minutes behind the first team. Their answer: "We traded preparation for confidence in our instruments, and the instruments were insufficient." Vale nodded and said nothing. The third team had 2 members who had struggled with the cold water crossing to the point of an extended transit, and their time reflected it. Their answer was careful and detailed and ultimately circular. They knew the crossing was a vulnerability and had not resolved it in advance because they had not correctly modeled the current strength. Vale nodded and said nothing. Then he looked at Seathrak's team. Connolly started to speak, but Vale raised one finger not toward her exactly, but in the direction of the team generally, and said, "Vorkalen." Seathrak said, "We traded optimized individual composition for complementary weakness coverage. Our team contained speed, navigation, cold water capacity, and climbing ability, but no single member held more than 2 of those capabilities at high proficiency. The assembly required trust in each member's designated function and a willingness to constrain individual performance for collective completion." Vale was quiet for a moment. "You went back into the collapse section." The panel configuration was settling faster than our initial transit time permitted. That wasn't in the parameters. No. Why did you read the parameters as negotiable? This was a different question from the one Vale had asked at the extraction point, and Seathrak recognized it as such. I did not read them as negotiable. I read the objective team crosses the line together as primary, and the parameters as the anticipated sufficient condition for meeting that objective. When the anticipated sufficient condition became insufficient, I addressed the gap. Vale looked at him for a long moment, then he looked at Connolly. You chose this team. Yes, senior instructor. Walk me through it. Connolly did not look at her team members. She looked at the topographic projection which was still showing the course. Seathrak navigates better than anyone else in the barracks. Imrel runs faster and handles terrain better than anyone else in the barracks. Preth can operate in environments none of us can. Osavek is getting better every week. She paused. And the four of them together cover everything the course throws, including the collapse section. I didn't know about Seathrak going back in, Connolly said. That was his call. Vale's eyes moved the independent swivel both directions. He was quiet for long enough that the room felt it. Then he said, the record for this course has stood for 4 cycles. He looked at the first team. You were 3 minutes and 50 seconds off it, which is your best performance this quarter. He looked at Seathrak's team. You were 4 minutes and 11 seconds off it. He looked back at the room. The record team was all from the same species, all at peak individual proficiency in every course element. They were very good. He picked up his hand lamp from the edge of the table. Dismissed. He walked out. Sothas said quietly into the silence, he didn't give us a lesson. He gave us several, Preth said, with the same flat precision they applied to thermal gradient readings. Seathrak sat with that for a moment. He thought about the record team, same species, peak individual proficiency, 4-cycle record, and about the fact that Vale had mentioned them to the room that also contained a team that had finished the course with a cold-sensitive Tharvan, a navigation-limited run across a thermal-vented ridge, and one unplanned re-entry into a collapsing debris field. He thought about the fact that Vale had not said the record team was better. He had described them accurately as very good. And then he thought about the thing that had happened in the collapse section, when the gap was closing and the margin was unfavorable, and he had gone back in. He had not gone back in because of a calculation. The calculation had been fast and accurate and real, but it had occurred after something that preceded it, a moment in which he had simply looked at the gap and at Osavek mid-transit, and the idea of not going back had not registered as a viable option. He had been processing the team as a unit since before the run began, since before the water crossing, when he had slowed without planning to, since the ridge corridor, when he had called the reroutes out loud instead of correcting silently, because Connolly had told him to communicate early, and he had found, in the practice of it, that the team moved better when he did. He was Velhari. He processed and categorized. He did not form attachments rapidly. It was not in his species' social architecture, which ran on structured obligation networks and long-term covenant systems. Velhari did not have the human concept of a chosen family. They had the Velhari concept of a covenant mesh, a group in which each member's obligations to the others were explicitly negotiated and recorded and carried the weight of formal contract. He ran a brief internal analysis and found that he had, at some point during the past 6 weeks, developed something that functioned equivalently. He had not negotiated it. He had not recorded it. It had assembled itself out of accumulated small decisions, staying at Osavek's pace on the run, filing Imrel's terrain observations without judgment, adjusting his communication behavior on Connolly's instruction, slowing at the water crossing for no reason he could precisely name. Each decision had been individually minor. In aggregate, they had produced something that Seathrak's categorization system could not file under any of his standard headers. He filed it under a new one. The qualification trial was in 2 weeks. Vale announced it during the evening formation, 3 days after the Kara descent debrief, in the same unheated voice he used for everything, and then he laid out what it was. A comprehensive team exercise that would constitute 50% of each cadet's performance tier evaluation for the quarter. The exercise specifics would not be released until the morning of the trial. Team composition would be fixed as of the following day. Whatever you had, that was what you ran with. There would be no substitutions. This created, in the barracks that evening, the particular social atmosphere that Seathrak had come to recognize as the intermediate state between controlled anxiety and performed calm. Species with visible emotional signaling, the Tharvan frills, the Kreth vocal modulation, the way the two Lovar cadets in Barracks 7 moved slightly closer to each other in elevate-head stress situations, were all expressing something in the range of concerned. Species with less visible signaling were moving slightly faster than their baseline, making small decisions with slightly more abruptness. Seathrak was processing at a rate he would estimate as 30% above his resting cognitive load, which for a Velhari was a form of elevated stress expression that no one who had not lived with Velhari for a long time would recognize as such. He was processing whether their team was the right team for an unknown exercise. He went through the analysis for approximately 12 minutes, alone at the base of his bunk, with the barracks partially settled for the evening. He considered the individual proficiency gaps. He considered the scenarios in which a cold water crossing reappeared, or a high-speed navigation challenge, or a strength differential obstacle. He considered the scenarios in which none of those were the primary challenge, in which the exercise tested something he hadn't modeled. He ran his probability trees, and found that the outputs converged consistently on the same result. He went to find Connolly. She was outside, which he had expected humans. He had observed preferred outdoor space when processing, possibly because their species had evolved in open environments where the ability to assess long-range threats was neurologically relevant. She was sitting on the equipment ledge at the north end of the parade ground with her back to the barracks wall, looking at the dark ridgeline where the Kara descent began. "You're processing the qualification," he said. "Yes." "I did the analysis," he said. "The team composition holds." She looked at him. In the low light her face was difficult to read. Humans had a high density of microexpressions and Seathrak's accuracy with them had improved over 6 weeks, but was still below the threshold he would consider reliable. He read something that was either skepticism or curiosity, which was a wide range. "Walk me through it," she said. The same words Vale had used in the debrief. He recognized this as deliberate, or possibly absorbed habit. Connolly's vocabulary under operational conditions had a precision that suggested deliberate selection. Preth covers any scenario requiring non-standard environmental operation. Imrel covers any scenario requiring sustained physical performance on difficult terrain. Osavek is 3 weeks ahead of where they were at formation, which is a better rate of improvement than the margin analysis suggested was possible, which means my original model of Osavek was incorrect in the direction of underestimation. He paused. "I have updated it." Connolly was quiet for a moment, and me. "You see the thing that needs doing before the system has categorized it as a task," Seathrak said. "You assembled this team when the optimal metric-based composition would have produced a faster time on the Kara descent but would not have included all 4 of us. I did not understand the reasoning at the time." He looked at the ridge line. "I understand it now." Connolly was still looking at him. He could hear the very slight change in her breathing that preceded a sentence she was selecting carefully. "You know what the qualification trial will probably test," she said. "I have hypotheses." "Which ones?" "Something that requires the team to function under conditions that advantage none of us individually," he said. "Vale has spent 6 weeks running exercises that isolate team cohesion as a variable. He controls for individual competence by pairing species with complementary limitations. The qualification trial will require the cohesion to perform under pressure that the individual performances cannot absorb. He looked at her. The specific scenario is almost certainly irrelevant. The variable being evaluated is whether we function as a unit when the individual strategies fail. Connolly was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Yes." "I wanted to verify my analysis," Seathreck said. "It's right." "Good." He looked at the ridge line again. "I also wanted to tell you that I went back into the collapse section because the team needed to come through, not because the margin analysis compelled it. The analysis was real. It was not prior." He paused. "I thought you should know that." Connolly was quiet for a long enough moment that Seathrack's probability estimate on what she would say collapsed into a single outcome that he had not anticipated. She said nothing, which was how humans indicated that a thing had landed that they did not want to diminish with a response. Then she said, 2 weeks, which was not a response to what he had said, but was a thing that contained the same information as one. "Yes," he said. They sat on the equipment ledge for another few minutes, looking at the dark ridge line, and then went back inside. The qualification trial brief was distributed at 0500 on the day of the exercise, which was precisely early enough that no cadet had slept adequately and precisely late enough that no team had time to run a thorough contingency analysis. Seathrack read it in 1 minute and 40 seconds, which was faster than his standard read time for operational documents because he had already built the structural model, and the brief required only slot filling. The exercise, a simulated forward base evacuation, a notional position in the northern ridge system, not the Kara descent, a separate section of terrain that none of them had run had been compromised. The team's objective was to extract 3 designated non-ambulatory casualties from the position and bring them to the extraction point 4 kilometers away within 90 minutes. The casualties were simulated by weighted carries. Each casualty mass was specified in the brief, the lightest at 43 kilograms and the heaviest at 61 kilograms. The terrain was not pre-surveyed. They would read it as they went. There would be 2 obstacles in the terrain that were not fully specified in the brief, designated as live decision points, meaning the course designers had deliberately left them undescribed to prevent pre-planning. Seathrack read this and ran one calculation that resolved instantly. The heaviest carry would require MREL Sothas. The Kreth's upper body strength was the highest in the team by a significant margin. That was the easy part. The hard part was 2 unspecified obstacle types, 43 to 61 kilograms of simulated casualty per carry position, and terrain none of them had read. He looked at Connolly. She was looking at the carry mass specifications. She said, "I'll take the midweight. You take the lightest, your endurance is better for navigation while carrying. Emrel takes the 61. Osivek," Seathreck said. "Osivek runs support." She held up a hand not to stop him, but a precise gesture that meant she was already there. "Osivek's strength isn't at carry weight. Their cardiovascular improvement means they can run support, spot obstacles, and rotate assists on the carry positions if either of us needs a break. Preth runs the retreat ahead of us. Preth's carry capacity is..." "I know what it is. Preth reads the terrain and spots the obstacles before we hit them carrying dead weight. That's worth more than their carry output." She looked up from the brief. "Unless you have a different model." Seathrack considered for approximately 3 seconds. "No, the model is correct." Osivek, who had been reading the brief with the careful focus of a cadet, who had learned to suspect that the documented parameters were not the complete operational reality, said, "The unspecified obstacles." "We read them when we hit them," Connolly said. "I can perform the obstacle read faster than your response time if I am already forward," Preth said. They had been standing at the edge of the briefing area, appearing to study the terrain map, but apparently also absorbing the conversation. "I will provide the team a minimum of 30 seconds of advance notice before each obstacle. You will have time to adjust the carry formation. Good, Connolly said. Anything else? Silence. Move, she said. The first kilometer was uphill, which Seathrek had modeled as the highest energy expenditure segment because carry weight at gradient increase compounds faster than linear prediction. He was carrying 43 kilograms in a harness carry. The simulated casualty was dead weight, secured at the torso, and it shifted on every uneven footing. The shift was the problem. Not the mass, which his species' musculature could sustain at reasonable pace, but the dynamic mass distribution, which required constant proprioceptive microcorrection in a way that competed with his navigational processing. He had not modeled this precisely. He updated the model on the first 100 meters and began allocating more processing capacity to the carry mechanics, which reduced his navigation speed by an amount he estimated at approximately 12%. This was not catastrophic. He kept moving. Preth came back from the route forward at the 400-meter mark. First obstacle at 700 meters. It's a gap-crossing 2-meter lateral span over a 2-meter drop. The landing surface is stable. The takeoff surface is narrow and angled. Width on the takeoff surface: 60 centimeters, not enough for a wide stance carry approach. Connolly said, we go side carry at the gap. Single file approach MREL first. The 61 kilo needs the most stable carry and he's got the arm length to span it in 2 steps. Then you Seathrek. Then me. Osavek your post gap you call the landing. No one asked for elaboration. They moved. The gap crossing was exactly as Preth had described. Sothas went through with the 61-kilogram carry in 3 steps, and a controlled landing that produced a sound like a large piece of machinery being set down, which was accurate because that was what had happened. Seathrek went through in 2 steps, and a half step that was slightly more improvised than he would have preferred, but that achieved a stable landing. Connolly went through in 2 steps, landing clean, and Osavek called out the footing angle on the landing surface that allowed each of them to correct before weight transfer. They were at the 4-kilometer mark in 41 minutes, which was ahead of the pace they needed but not comfortable enough to treat as margin. The second obstacle arrived at the 2.8-kilometer mark, which Preth called with 22 seconds of advance notice rather than 30. The terrain fold had concealed it from the forward route until Preth was close enough that the time buffer compressed. 22 seconds. Seathrek ran the implication. Less pre-calculation time, more reaction weight on the team's decision chain. Water obstacle, Preth said. It's not a river. It's a depression 20 meters wide, approximately 1 meter deep at the center. Water temp is close to ambient. The bottom is soft, organic substrate, not mineral. Soft bottom at carry weight, Seathrek said, already running the analysis. The dynamic mass from the carry harness would increase the effective ground pressure per footfall substantially. On soft organic substrate at 1 meter depth, the footing penetration per step could reach 5 to 8 centimeters, which added significant energy expenditure and reduced pace to an unpredictable degree. How wide is the perimeter? Connolly asked. The obstacle footprint is 20 meters wide, but the depression is not uniform. The soft bottom zone is about 12 meters centered. The edges have firmer substrate. Edges only. Edges only. Connolly was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, we go single file along the right edge. Preth runs the edge line first and marks the firm substrate boundary. We step inside the marks. Osavek, you're the center of the carry formation. You set the pace on this section. We match you. This reversed the carry formation hierarchy, placing Osavek as the pace setter rather than the support position. Seathrek processed this. Osavek had the most consistent stride length in the team, which on a narrow, firm substrate edge with soft ground immediately adjacent was worth more than raw speed. The reversal was correct. Osavek looked at Connolly, then at the obstacle. Their frills were entirely flat. the controlled stillness that Seathrek had learned over 6 weeks to recognize as focused activation rather than suppression. "I can set the pace," Osivek said. "Good," Connolly said. They moved. The edge crossing took 6 minutes. It should not have taken 6 minutes. 6 minutes was slow, and slow cost time, but the soft substrate encroachment on the right edge was more variable than Preth's initial read had suggested, and twice Osivek stopped and redirected the formation 2 steps inward when the edge compressed under weight. Seathrek noted each stop and did not comment. The stops prevented carries going into the soft substrate under load. The stops were correct. They crossed with 18 minutes remaining. The extraction point was 300 meters away. Seathrek could see it. They ran. Not the careful formation run of the gap crossing or the deliberate pace of the edge crossing. A genuine run, all 5 of them, carrying dead weight at a pace that Seathrek would not have modeled as sustainable at the beginning of the exercise. That was only sustainable because the end was visible and proximity to the objective generated a physiological response in at least 3 of his team members that appeared to temporarily exceed their calculated performance envelopes. He realized, experiencing something in the same category. He was also running faster than the model said he should be. They crossed the extraction point at 84 minutes and 31 seconds. Vale was there. He had been there since before they arrived. How long before was not something Seathrek could determine, and he was standing with his hands behind his back and his eyes doing the independent swivel and a datapad in the hand behind his back that he had not taken out to check the time. He already knew it. "Set down your carries," Vale said. They did. Vale looked at the datapad. He looked at them. He looked at the datapad again, which was the first time Seathrek had ever seen Vale look at a thing twice, and filed it under behaviorally significant. 84:31, Vale said. "You are the second fastest team across the 4 barracks." The first team Seathrek ran the estimate was probably the same Kreth-heavy formation from the Kara descent, which had the raw carry capacity and speed to run a different strategy entirely. The fastest team ran a straight-line route on both obstacle sections, Vale said, without any of them having asked. They took the crossing at full width. They have the carry weight and the leg strength to manage soft substrate at pace. He paused. They finished at 79 minutes. 5 minutes, the gap was 5 minutes. You ran edge only on the water crossing, Vale said. You added approximately 90 seconds to your transit time by routing around the soft substrate instead of through it. The alternative added carry weight ground pressure on soft substrate, Seathrek said. The energy expenditure penalty on full-width soft crossing, for our specific carry masses and species distribution, exceeded the time cost of the edge route by approximately 3 minutes of additional fatigue expenditure in the final kilometer. Vale looked at him. You modeled that in real time. I modeled the parameters in real time. Cadet Connolly made the route call. Because your model said the edge route was correct. I communicated the analysis. She executed the decision. Vale was quiet for a moment. He looked at Connolly. He looked at Osivek. He looked at Sothas and Preth. He looked at Seathrek. Then he said something that Seathrek had not modeled as a probable output. He said, "This team will be recommended for the advanced operational track. You will receive the formal notification through the Academy system in the next 48 hours. He paused. It is not a question. Not a question, which was Vale's convention for. The decision has already been made, and this announcement is informational. Sothas made a sound, the Kreth equivalent of a short bark that functioned as surprise satisfaction, and then covered it with a hand, which was unnecessary because Vale did not appear to register it as a breach of decorum. Osivek's frills lit suddenly bright. The bioluminescent activation that Seathrek had learned meant something between pride and relief that was too large to contain. Preth looked at Vale with the full-face focus that their species used instead of any other expression. Seathrak looked at Connolly. She was looking at him with the same expression she had used in the collapse section when he came back through the gap, the recognition expression, the one his categorization system still did not have a precise label for. He had been building a more accurate model of it over the past 2 weeks. He thought he might have a label now. "You said the team crosses the line together," he said to her. "Not the qualification trial, the Kara descent, 6 weeks ago, the first time she had said it before the run began." "I did," she said. "I understand now why that was the specification." She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "I know." Vale picked up his datapad and walked away. The formal notification arrived in 37 hours, not 48, which Seathrak categorized as either administrative efficiency or a deliberate signal that the recommendation had required no internal deliberation to process. He ran equal probability on both. In the barracks that evening, after the notification had been acknowledged by all 4 of them through the academy system, Sothas appeared at the end of Seathrak's bunk with a length of woven cordage, and a Kreth tradition that involved tying a knot formation that the Kreth called a binding acknowledgement, a gesture reserved for group commitments of long-term operational duration. Seathrak had read about the tradition. He had not been the recipient of it. "It doesn't mean anything formal," Sothas said, holding the cordage. "I know it's not Velhari architecture, but you went back into that gap, and you're the reason the formation held at the water obstacle, and I wanted to mark it." Seathrak looked at the cordage. He thought about covenant meshes and obligation networks and the Velhari social architecture that ran on explicit negotiation and recorded contract. And he thought about the fact that he had been operating inside something that had none of those formal properties and all of those functional properties for 6 weeks, and had not noticed the moment it had become something he would not choose to be outside of. "Yes," he said. Osivek appeared from the far bunk. So did Preth. Connolly was already there, which suggested she had anticipated the tradition and arrived before the presentation, which was a thing Connolly did. She prepared for the things that mattered before anyone else had categorized them as requiring preparation. Sothas made the binding acknowledgement formation with the cordage, running it through a loop at each of their wrists in the Kreth convention, and when it was done, he pulled it loose because that was also part of the tradition. The binding was not in the knot, but in the making of it. The knot was evidence. The covenant was in having performed it together. Seathrak held the loose cord for a moment. Then he folded it and put it in the inner pocket of his duty jacket, which was where Velhari placed objects that held covenant weight. He had not planned to do that. The action had preceded any calculation he could locate. He was, by this point, used to that. The barracks settled into the ordinary sounds of an evening before a new training cycle: equipment checks, low conversations, the particular quiet that a group of people made when they were not performing calm, but actually had it. Seathrak lay on his bunk and ran a final brief inventory of the day's events, which was his standard pre-sleep processing routine. He found that the inventory took longer than it used to because there was more in it than operational data. There was a record of 43 kilogram carry mechanics under gradient stress, and a soft substrate edge crossing at pace, and Vale looking at his datapad twice. There was a record of Osivek's frills lighting when the notification arrived. There was a record of Sothas's bark expression, covered with a hand. There was a record of Preth's full-face attention on a ceremony Preth had not been required to acknowledge. And there was a record of Connolly looking at him across the extraction point, with the expression his categorization system had finally found a label for. The label was, "She already knew you were going to do it." Not predicted, known. The distinction was one he had been trying to articulate to himself for 2 weeks, since the collapse section, when she had said "good call," and he had said the margins were unfavorable, and she had said "yeah," in a way that indicated she was not talking about the margins. He had been processing his team as a unit for weeks. She had been processing him as part of the unit for longer than that, since before the Kara descent, probably since the formation run, possibly since the meal table when she had looked at him across the trays and said, "You're the fourth." He had thought that was a recruitment decision. A 4-slot team with a Velhari navigator was a tactically sound configuration. He ran the probability tree now from the beginning and found that the tactically sound configuration was real and was also not the complete model. The complete model included the thing Connolly had told him about on the equipment ledge, not directly, but in the way she selected her words, which was deliberate and precise and meant that the words she chose were load-bearing. 2 weeks. The thing that contained the same information as a response, when what he had said did not warrant a response from a purely informational standpoint. He had gone back into the gap because the team needed to come through. She had told him she already knew. He thought about that for a moment, then he closed his eyes. Outside, through the narrow barracks window, the dark ridgeline of the Kara descent was still there, barely visible against the terraformed moon's night sky, and the thermal vents in the lower course were cycling in a pattern that his proprioceptive system could sense as a faint atmospheric shift even at this distance. He had memorized that pattern. He had memorized the shale apron at the 200-meter mark and the firm substrate edge of the water obstacle, and the precise span of the gap crossing that Preth had called at 22 seconds rather than 30. He would be running terrain like this again. They all would. In the advanced operational track, where Vale had recommended them not as a collection of individuals with complementary capabilities, but as a unit, which was a different thing. The thing his categorization system had needed 6 weeks and 1 qualifying exercise to label accurately. He had a label for it now. He slept,